Welcome everyone. This is Virtual Machines All the Way Down. This is my first talk for BSides, so I'm glad we have a full house here. It's very exciting for me. Today we're going to talk about making an advanced information security lab, and that's going to be utilizing a lot of virtualization. If you're not familiar with the reference I made with the title here, this is in reference to a story about people talking about what props up the world, and the answer being a giant turtle holding the world on its back. And the question then becomes, well, what is the turtle standing on? Another turtle, which leads to the conclusion that it's turtles all the way down. So when it comes to virtualization, you can kind of get this feeling a little bit. Things get very meta, kind of inception-y when you're doing virtualization in a nested format, virtualized switches, routers, and all of this stuff. But what I'm going to try to do over the next hour is make this an understandable thing that will help you take your virtualization and therefore infosec skills to the next level. First of all, who am I? My name is John Hubbard, and I work for GlaxoSmithKline, a big pharmaceutical company. I'm their lead analyst for the United States SOC, and I am also a community SANS instructor. I've taught penetration testing as well as currently teaching SEC 511, which is continuous monitoring and security operations. But most importantly for this talk, I'm a guy who's set up a lot of labs recently. I've kind of gone crazy collecting stuff at my house and tried a lot of stuff, so I thought I would impart some of the knowledge that I gained from doing that with the community here. There's my Twitter, my blog post, or my blog entry, which the slides will be posted at afterwards. So a quick rundown of the topics here. First, why the different types of virtualization. There's going to be the two types, type 1 and type 2. A lot of you have probably tried type 2 before, but we're going to go a little more into type 1, which is the more professional business use type virtualization with ESXi and things like that that people may have not tried on their own at home. I'm also going to suggest some hardware that I like for running these virtualization labs, some software that I like running them with, hypervisor-wise, as well as the software to run with them. So that would be your virtual machines that I suggest, as well as hardware networking gear, and then the setups for the network for those things. So first of all is, why do you want to do this? Obviously, we're all here to learn, and that's what you're going to do with your lab. Now, many of you may have set up individual virtual machines before and tried either breaking into them, defending them, whatever it may be. But in this case, we're going to take it a step further than that. And we're going to set up a whole entire company-style network. We're going to have different zones. And we're going to emulate a whole bunch of different virtual machines and network infrastructure here to really take it to the next level. You can practice attack that way. You can practice defense. You can do both at once. And while you do that, you're also going to learn things like system administration, networking, and secure design. Like I said, with the goal being emulate a company infrastructure all inside one computer. So this is where we're going with that. In the past, I'm sure you've all seen labs that look like this. They sit in your basement. You don't need to use your furnace anymore because it creates so much heat. I don't know if it saves on heating bills or not, but we're going to try to make it more so like the picture on the right, which if you can't tell has a picture of itself in the picture. Access point, a switch, and a computer is mainly where I'm trying to go here. So this is affordable and physically easy, cheap, and efficient. And this is just a summary where we're going, but just so you know, the type of thing we're going to talk about here can be exploded into a network that looks like this with multiple different switches, lots of different VMs, firewalls, monitoring infrastructure, and all this kind of stuff, which we'll go into. But before we go into this, please consider your goals. There's a lot of ways that you can accomplish this. There's going to be attack-centric setups, defense-centric, or secure architecture, whatever you're focusing on. Also consider if there's a particular package that you use at work, you might want to lean toward using that for your home lab also. If you want to be able to take this on the road, or if this is going to sit at home on your network, that's another consideration that's going to drive all these requirements that you come up with, as well as whether you're willing to put this in line with your home network or not. Also, power and noise, obviously a concern for most of us. So the focus of this talk, what I'm going to try to hit on is optimizing the virtualization setup, minimizing software expense, hardware expense, and power used, and maximize the flexibility and what I would call significant other acceptance factor, because that's important probably to a lot of us. So how are we going to do that? We're going to take software that is free, open source, and utilize that as much as possible. There's a lot of really great solutions for that out there. Where there isn't an available solution for that, we're going to leverage the free home trials that a lot of the big corporations will offer to people that want to play with this at home. They want people to learn it at home and then go to work and say, oh, I already know this package, let's get that here. A lot of times that's going to help us out. And where that isn't an option, we're going to have free trials that we're going to try to leverage intelligently and hopefully just deal with refreshing those virtual machines when they expire. Hardware-wise, we're going to virtualize everything as much as we can. We're going to virtualize our endpoints, our network infrastructure, and our security and monitoring infrastructure, and we're going to minimize our hardware purchase. We don't want anything to do a single job. I don't know if anyone here watches Good Eats, but Alton Brown refers to his rule of the kitchen, which is no unitaskers. And so we're going to follow that rule with network hardware and with our computers. We don't want a computer to be a single computer ever. We want it to be multiple computers. We want switches to be multiple switches. We want Wi-Fi access points to act like they're multiple Wi-Fi access points. So we're going to leverage all of this together in one and try to make a very, very flexible setup that can do almost anything you want for as cheap as possible. The first thing you need to know about is hypervisors, which is the fancy term for what's running your virtual machines. There are two types of them. You're probably familiar with type 2. This is the hosted version, and this is the things that you see like VMware and VirtualBox. You have your hardware, and then your operating system, and that's running a hypervisor, and that's your VMware and your VirtualBox running another set of operating systems above that conceptually. Then you have the type 1, which is the bare metal native hypervisors. These are running OSs directly, and there's only one layer in between here. Now, there is a theoretical technical difference maybe in the past and not so important now on how these leverage the CPU built-in hardware registers to create virtualization. That's not really important to us whether it is or is not technically type 1. What really is important to us is how we're using this lab. And mainly it's going to come down to is if you're using the computer like a normal computer, you're going to need to use type 1. If this is going to be a separate computer, and you're going to leave it in place or carry it additionally with you, that can be a type 1 because that is not something that you can use like a normal computer otherwise. So your type 2 options, this is just a quick summary. We're going to go into detail here. But mainly that's going to be VMware Workstation, not Player. I'll cover that. Oracle VirtualBox, QEMU and KVM is the Linux free option. And there's also Microsoft Windows Client Hyper-V, and there's Parallels for Mac OS. First of all, Workstation. This is probably the one we've all heard of. There is VMware Player, which is VMware's free option, but you cannot use that because it does not allow snapshots and you cannot run more than one virtual machine at once. So this is just going to be out, unfortunately. But Workstation and Fusion, if you have a Mac, is the same thing. It's a great, great option. I call this the industry standard because when you get a lot of VMs, pre-built virtual machines for security or whatever it may be, they'll often come in VMware format. So that's one big benefit of doing this. Workstation costs about $250 with a $100 upgrade, and Fusion is $80 with $50 upgrades. So it's a little bit on the expensive side, but it's the premium product when it comes to virtualization. The other big win about this is if you run two labs, or two physical machines at once, one running ESXi and one running Workstation, you can use the virtual machines on the ESXi box from your VMware Workstation on your computer as if they were local. So there's some wins to be had there if you're using both of those things. Overall, I would recommend this if you're willing to pay for it, if you want to control local and remote virtual machines, or if you want to ensure you have the best compatibility, because it seems like this is the one that people always go to when they need a format. Now, if you want to go to the other side of the spectrum, there's VirtualBox. This is totally free. It comes cross-platform. And it is what I would call the other standard because a lot of times you can also download things in this format. These are the two that are going to be the most compatible. There's a little bit of a difference if hardware is required. Hardware virtualization is not required for 32-bit virtualization in VMware. So if you have some really old hardware, you might want to look at this because Workstation is probably not going to be compatible with that. Some other interesting features in this are you can run this headless and kind of pretend like it's a type 1 and have it remotely on your network and connect to it with RDP to your virtual machines. That's an interesting option that none of the other ones offer. Overall, I would recommend this as something to try first to make sure it works, or if it works, because if it does, it's free and that's great. It's going to be free forever, so give it a shot as a first try. There's some other type 2 options you've probably heard of, but these are less common. So Windows Client Hyper-V. This is a very high quality product. It comes free with Windows 8 and above if you have the professional version. It does not come with the home version of Windows, but it works great. It integrates with the Microsoft's type 1 solution, which is Hyper-V Server, which we'll cover in a minute. So if you want those features, maybe consider the Windows one. I don't see as many virtual machines packaged in this format, so you may have an issue there. QEMU and KVM is a Linux solution. KVM stands for Kernel Virtualization Module, and that is the actual kernel module in Linux that does the hardware virtualization with the CPU. And QEMU is the thing pretending to be the computer components. So those two things work together. The main thing I would say about this is that it does not come with the GUI. It's kind of bare bones. If you want to add a GUI to it and make it act like VirtualBox, Virt Manager is one of the standard options for that. You can run different architectures on this. That's one of the other key points. If you want to run a Raspberry Pi virtually, you can do it with QEMU and KVM. So that's one thing that if you have a side case like that, you might want to consider this solution. Parallels is another one. It's Mac only. It works fine. If you have it already, go ahead and use it. But if you're looking to something to buy, it costs the same as Workstation, so I wouldn't recommend it because it's not going to be as compatible with everything else. For type 1, here's the stuff that we're here to talk about mainly. This is going to be ESXi, aka vSphere Hypervisor. I think they just kind of added that name on the last version. There's also Zen Server. This is free. Proxmox is a Debian-based Linux that is a type 1 hypervisor, and then Hyper-V Server from Microsoft. vSphere Hypervisor, aka ESXi, is an industry standard, I would say, and that many, many businesses use it. This is something you're very likely to see at work and in professional virtualization situations. The downside here is that it's very picky about its hardware. You can't just throw this on any machine and have it work. You can check if it's likely to work. There's a hardware compatibility list. If you just Google ESXi, HCL, that you can check if your computer is going to work with it. But since this is geared to run on professional level hardware, mostly that's the stuff that's going to be in there. Your Dell desktop is not going to be on that list. That being said, there's still a very good chance that you can run it on that, but you may need to add some drivers into the ISO before you try to install it, because if it doesn't recognize your network card, it won't let you install it. So you can slipstream drivers in and still get it to work on some desktops. Free version has some feature restrictions, but they shouldn't matter to you unless you have a really crazy setup. It's like 96 gigs of RAM or more than 4 physical processors, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. I would recommend you try this first as a type 1 solution because it's very user-friendly, and if it works, it's great. It's a very good experience in terms of type 1 hypervisors. The other downside that I didn't mention is they used to have a Windows thick client you had to manage it with, but it's actually transitioning to a web front end now. It's not perfect, but it's plenty good to use, so be aware of that. Proxmox VE, this is one that people probably haven't heard of if you haven't looked into this. This is basically Debian Linux with KVM and a web front end to direct all the virtual machines being run. This is going to be compatible with anything that's going to run Linux, so that's going to be almost every computer you're going to be able to run this on. It has a very nice web front end. People use this for production situations. This isn't like test software. It's very high quality. I would recommend this as maybe the VirtualBox solution of type 1 hypervisors. You can think of it like that. So if you want something that's totally open and free, you have hardware issues, you may need to use the CLI and Google a little bit. The documentation isn't as great, but it is out there. Things are constantly changing. They have a wiki on their site. They sell paid support, so that might be some of the reason that they don't have perfect documentation out there, is because they're selling that to support the development. But other than that, this is what I use at home. I think it's a great solution. And of course, if you don't have a Windows PC to manage your type 1 hypervisor, you're going to need that. Zen Server, this is the other option. This kind of sits between the two. This is professional level quality. A lot of big corporations use this. AWS runs on it, Rackspace runs on it, Linode, all of those things. So this is great quality. Unfortunately, it's also picky about the hardware. This is totally free, whereas with ESX, they're giving you a free version that you have to still get a registration key for. They just give it to you free. The downside here is that it's managed by Zen Center, which is a Windows-only client. So if you don't have Windows, there are some third-party solutions people have cooked up, but I've not tried them to know if they're going to work or not. So something to think about. Hyper-V Server, you might use this at work. It's free. You can install it. It is Windows Server, but if you're just doing the Hyper-V role, it can be done free. I tried to install this and play with it. It was very frustrating. It wants to be on an Active Directory environment. If you're running Active Directory at home, which maybe you will be doing after this talk, you can run this and get it done easily. But if you just try to run Hyper-V server on its own, it's going to want to have a bunch of exceptions made for trusts and things like that to control it. But if you're running client Hyper-V, the interaction is very nice, like Workstation with ESXi. You can control those remote machines and have a local console for that. So it's very convenient if you have a good reason to use it, but otherwise I wouldn't recommend it. So between these two, when you need to decide what should you think about, do you have an extra computer is going to be the main one. If you don't have an extra computer, you're probably going to be stuck with Type 2 because you can't run Type 1 as a primary operating system on your laptop that you carry around and use every day. Also consider whether your hardware is compatible. Consider whether the networking gear you have that's going to go with this at home is going to be allowing what you want to do with it to happen, which we'll go into in a second. What VMs are you running? Are you running anything ARM, MIPS, any of the alternative processors that might be running is going to require QEMU? And then how do you want to manage it? Windows, mainly. If you're running Windows, you have all the options you want. If you're not running Windows, maybe Proxmox is your better option. And then, of course, cost. So my overall recommendation here is if you have the money and you have the hardware that's compatible, go with VMware Workstation and ESX all around. If you want to go totally free and open source, go with VirtualBox and Proxmox. Both of those are great options. What if you want to try them and you're not really sure what you want? This is where things get a little weird. You can run Type 2 virtualization running a Type 1 hypervisor. So you can install ESXi, Proxmox, and Xen on VMware Workstation and then install VMs in that. So yes, this is where your mind starts exploding and things get very hard to keep track of, but it can be done. And I would highly recommend you try this if you've never done this before, because not only will you get to play with the interfaces and make sure that you actually like how you're going to control all this, but when you're done, you can take your VMs and move them out one level when you install it on your real hardware and just move them over to the actual hardware when you install it. So you won't necessarily be wasting too much time doing that if you can set it up. Now the downside is you're going to need a lot of RAM because you're going to be cutting off a big chunk to run the Type 1 hypervisor, and then all of it inside that is going to be used for the VMs you install. So it's possible. I wanted to note that. OK, so hardware. What do you need to do this? You're going to need, most importantly, a lot of RAM. That's going to be the thing that you're almost for sure going to run out of first. So if you're trying to decide where to spend money, spend it on RAM. The second thing that you're going to run out of is hard drive space. Speed is nice when it comes to hard drives because it allows snapshots to revert very quickly and be taken very quickly, but space is king here because you will run into a wall and you'll hate yourself if you can't take that snapshot and you're getting to a point where you're constantly fighting disk space. So get a big disk, and if you can afford it, get a fast big disk. Some more obscure stuff is going to be the specific CPU features. VTX is the key one. VTX allows your CPU to do efficient virtualization. Almost every CPU has it at this point. If you go back maybe to 2010 or before, you might be looking at some stuff that doesn't have it. But if you're going to buy lab hardware, that's the one key thing you definitely want to have, is make sure that processor supports VTX. VTD is another option that comes on some of the even newer stuff. And with that, you can actually pass an entire PCI device as if it were connected directly to a virtual machine. So if you're trying to do a virtual password cracking rig of some sort and you need to pass your GPU directly to a virtual machine, perhaps you could do it with VTD. I haven't tried that myself. I've heard that it can be done. And that's the feature that allows it. AES is another one. If you want to encrypt your whole lab hard drive, AES-NI is the feature that allows efficient encryption. When it comes to the package, consider if it's going to travel. You could do a laptop or a NUC. If you want a quiet, expandable option, go with the desktop. If your life philosophy is turned down for what, go with the rack mount. You're going to get something loud and rude, but it's going to be awesome. So my recommendation here for minimum specs would be 16 gigs of RAM, 500 gigs of hard drive, and an i5 from maybe the last 4 or 5 years. Probably the 2000 series. I've never tried with the 1000, but I think they would probably work too. Ideal would be 32 gigs of RAM, at least a terabyte, SSD if you can afford it. and a quad-core i7 or a Xeon even. Here's some of my favorite hardware. It's not actually that expensive to get these specs. Whatever you have already, try that first, because it's very likely to work with Proxmox. If it doesn't, here's what I like to go to. This is a Lenovo ThinkPad. It's refurbished. It's $350. On Newegg, it's got an i7. It's got 16 gigs of RAM and a 1 terabyte hard drive, and it's only $350. So it's very portable. They work great. They can actually hold 2 hard drives in them, so even better. You can use it like a normal laptop, boot it off that, and then make it your Type 1 hypervisor later on if you want. If you want to step up to the tower, Lenovo makes a TS140, which stands for ThinkServer. And the whole line of ThinkServers is great, but the TS140 is the little version, and the TS150 is the just updated CPU version. It's not out yet, but they've announced it. You can get these for $389 with a Xeon processor, and you're going to add a little more RAM to that, so it might end up more like $500. But they are great computers. Reddit Home Lab loves these, so they're battle tested. They're great. You can run ESXi on them, but you're going to need to get a different network card, but that's it. Otherwise, they're compatible. And they also have a list that posts what type of hypervisors they're compatible with too. If you want to go with rack mount and serious server hardware, just go to the Home Lab wiki, because there's way too many considerations for me to come up with any kind of recommendation system there. Okay.
If I may, just a brief note, there's an amazing deal on 8-core processors, the E5 2670s.
Okay.
You can pick up the chips for around $70 a piece for an 8-core processor.
Wow.
And they'll get they have kits with dual CPU, 16-core real force total, and 64 gigs of RAM for about $600-700.
Wow.
If you want to go heavy,
Yeah, that's an awesome deal, especially if you get one of those TS140s and maybe that processor is compatible. That would be a great drop-in. So yeah, look for deals like that. Look for refurb. That's a great source. When it comes to planning your network, what you want to do is consider these 4 main pieces. Obviously your server, but your firewall and router is going to play a main piece in this, as well as a smart switch. I say smart switch because that is a specific term, as opposed to a unmanaged cheap switch that I'm sure you've all seen, or a managed switch, which is the really expensive thing. Smart switches tend to be the label that means I kind of have some professional features, but I'm not going to charge you a crazy amount for it. Also with the Wi-Fi access points, if you want to do something that's fairly complicated, get one that supports 802.1q, which is VLANs, and also has multi-SSIDs that it can broadcast, and then direct those to the different VLANs. I have a recommendation for that in a moment. Depending on what you want for these things and what you're trying to do, you may actually be able to virtualize the router and the switches, probably not the access point, but there are some options there if you don't want to buy those. So this is where you need to make a decision. Do you think you are willing to put your lab in line with your home network? It can work and it can be awesome. You can do your router and switches and everything, have that connect directly to your internet, and have a very awesome professional setup at home. The issue being is when your family calls and says the internet's out, how are you going to direct your children to go into your hypervisor and reset your router VM? It's not going to be as easy as unplug it and plug it back in. So,
submit a help desk ticket.
Yeah, or they can submit a help desk ticket. Right. So that being said, don't be too scared about this. I've had this set up for years, and it's never been a problem for me. It hasn't happened once. One thing I would suggest, if you do go with this and you're scared of that, have a home normal router set up so they can just switch the cord over and everything will work with a different Wi-Fi network. That's a way to mitigate that. If you have an extra machine, you can put this as another client on your network just like any other device you have. But that is going to come with the downside that you might have to buy some stuff depending on what you're trying to do. So also, if you have a dedicated laptop when you travel, or if you have to do it on the laptop you're traveling with, this is going to make the decision for your network. Here's what I have at home. Basically, this is a SOFA firewall that I use. This is a Cisco smart switch. It was about $80. And this is a Unify Wi-Fi access point, and then my lab server. Very simple physical. I do this because I think it is the most flexible setup that I could come up with for a reasonable amount of money. I have VLAN support throughout with all of those things. So every single pretend to be a different layer 3 network. SSID for each 3. So if I connect to one SSID, I might be in my DMZ. If I connect to a different SSID, I'll be on my internal network or my thing for Internet of Things devices, whatever it may be. All of VLAN traffic goes through my router. So that inherently makes not only what I do on my phone and everything else, but all of my lab server traffic visible. And I mirror that with the mirror port on my switch back to my lab server where I'm recording it all in full PCAP for defense VMs. Like almost anything, you can add all the networks you want all day with it. So it's a really great and flexible setup. You don't need to have stuff that supports VLANs. If you want to do the inline setup, it can all be virtual, so don't worry too much about that. How does my network look to a packet with those only? I have all of these zones. I have a guest zone for when people come over. I have a desktop network, which is all my trusted devices like my laptop. Security onion over here. If I'm hosting Minecraft for my friends or whatever, I have internal servers that only I want to be able to access inside, like my NAS. And then I have a research isolation zone of sorts where I do malware reverse engineering and things like that, where I want to make sure that stuff doesn't get out to the internet. All of that connects up through my router, and what you can't see in the middle here would be my switch. And then anything that goes through at all through the middle here is then echoed back to my security monitoring. So what specific hardware do I use for this? I have the Cisco SG200-08. That works for me. It's about $80. But in researching this talk, I found there's a $30 TP-Link Easy Smart series. The thing to know about that is version 2 is what you want to get, because before that you have to have Windows to manage it. So something to know there. For your router and firewall, you can do it yourself with pfSense, and I would highly recommend you try this first, because it's a very, very outstanding distribution that's a firewall and router. You can make all of the interfaces you want virtually, or you can run it on a separate cheap computer you have at home, maybe from 10 years ago, and it would have no problem. Sophos has a free version of their professional firewalls. There's two versions. There's Sophos UTM, which is the old kind, and then there's the XG firewall, which is the new kind. These both come with tons and tons of awesome options. You get antivirus, you get IDS, you get proxies, you can filter categories, you can do anything you want that a system administrator at a company with a real device of theirs would be able to do. They give you almost everything free. The only downside is that you have a 50 IP limit. So if you have a lot of stuff on your home network and you want to run a big lab, you might have an issue there. If you want to go with physical hardware, the Ubiquiti Edge Router X is $50, and it has all these features: integrated firewall, VPN, DHCP, DNS, all that stuff built in. So that's a good cheap option for physical. Wi-Fi. You don't need a Wi-Fi full router. All you need is an access point, because what you're going to be doing is connecting to the access point, and it's going to be pushing the traffic back up to your router and firewall, which will be making the decisions for you. So with that, you can take the access point you already have and run it in AP mode and just connect it to the switch. It doesn't need to be the router anymore. Also, if you want to do this in the professional way that allows VLANs and all of that, the Ubiquiti Unify AC series is great. They are $90 for the minimum one that they sell, and $150 for their all-out AC Pro router access point. These will allow you to make all the SSIDs you want, confuse your neighbors, and do all sorts of wild stuff. So that's probably as cheap as enterprise-grade Wi-Fi gets. I would highly recommend those. So do you have to buy any of this? No, you don't. As I made reference to, you can really just have your lab server sit there right next to your internet connection and have just a single Wi-Fi access point hanging off that. You can virtualize your router, your switches, and have this be a VLAN trunk or something like that. There's a lot of different options that you can do here, so you really don't have to buy this stuff if you don't want to. If you want to go for challenge mode, there's a Linux piece of software called Host APD with the ability to make a Wi-Fi card and access point. If your hardware supports it, you could try to do it all actually in literally one computer, but I've never tried that. Virtual networking concepts. This is something that's going to be important as we jump into how to do the networking here. So just one quick note. Assume when I say NIC for the rest of this, I mean like dropping one card in with one interface on it. I know it's probably not technically the right term, but I wanted something that I could make easily distinguishable. So for our lab server, we're going to have a lot of complication here. We're going to have multiple virtual machines with multiple virtual NICs that connect to multiple virtual switches, and all of those are going to connect to your physical ports, which are going to connect to potentially a virtualized router. There's a lot of complication going on there, and there's a lot of ways that you could hook that up. Some of the terms that you've probably seen with a type 2 installation are going to be bridged, host-only, internal, and NAT mode. In type 2 hypervisors, this is what it calls them in VMware Workstation and VirtualBox. So bridge mode is probably the most common. What it looks like here is you put a virtual switch out in front of your host PC, which is your actual computer, and all of your guest VMs look like just another device on the network. So if you want to do something that's safe, you're running another desktop machine, maybe you have Windows, you want to run Ubuntu also, you do this mode. If you're starting to do a little bit more risky stuff, or you want to run like Metasploitable, something you don't want accessible from the outside, then you start turning to host-only networking. Host-only networking puts a virtual second NIC on your actual host PC, and it connects that to a virtual switch, which is shared with the guest VM. The important piece here is that traffic cannot go this way. It will not route between these two interfaces. So your computer can talk to the VM, your computer can talk to the internet, but this cannot go all the way out. So the other option would be internal networking. This is where you have your host PC doing everything like normal, but you have multiple virtual machines that can talk to each other, but not to your actual computer. So if you're doing malware analysis or something like that, and you need complete isolation, this is the mode you're going to want to use. The last option you'll see is NAT mode. NAT mode is going to allow your computer to act pretty much like a home router, NATing all of the traffic behind it out one IP. If you're on a plane and you want to use VMs and you've bought Boingo access and you only get one IP, this is the mode you use. You at a hotel, whatever it may be, you put them all in NAT mode and it looks like one computer making traffic. Type 1 virtual networking, you're doing the same thing, but it does not hold your hand. You're manually making virtual switches and you're manually making these connections. All the concepts are the same though. Typically this is going to be bridge mode because you're going to want your VMs in your hypervisor to be able to talk outbound. So a lot of what we're going to be doing is making a virtual switch, connecting our VM to that, and then connecting that switch to a physical port where it can talk outbound. So the idea there is if you want to do it with VLANs, you're going to define the zones you want. You're going to make switches that are tagged with those VLAN numbers, connect everything to those, and then make sure those map correctly to the outside, and then everything will work like that. So the idea there is all the traffic gets tagged with a VLAN, and then it goes to the virtual switch. The virtual switch sends it outbound on a VLAN trunk to your smart switch, which can then push it up to your router, and then the firewall rules get applied at that point, and then it can go back into your network or wherever it's going from there. If you're not familiar with VLANs and you haven't used them at home, this is what's going on. If you want to have multiple different computers on multiple different networks, subnets that is, you could connect them all directly to a router, but we want to reuse our hardware. So what we're doing is we're allowing multiple different VLANs and Type 3 networks to go through the same physical link. So we have one Ethernet cable here and here, and then in my case at home, this is a virtual switch, these are VMs, and then the traffic from these two things would have to go out through here, up to the router, and then back in. If I wanted to talk from D to C, it would go all the way up and back down. So trunk is just the name for the thing that's carrying multiple different VLANs on one link. And that's how you get efficiency with this setup with your hardware. So for ESX, this is how you do it. You make your port groups. There's 4 different things you need to understand. There's port groups, virtual switches, physical NICs, and VM kernels. Your port group is going to be the group that where the VLAN tags are applied. So you set those up and you make all your zones, and then you take your virtual switches and you assign those port groups to a virtual switch. Then you take your physical NIC and you attach that switch to that physical NIC. And then you also take the VM kernel NIC, which is the port and IP you want to manage ESX on, and you connect that wherever you want also. Now, the thing to know about this, if you want to tap the virtual traffic, it's very easy, but you have to set up promiscuous mode, and you have to set it to accept. So make sure you do that if you want to be able to echo that traffic back to another VM. With ESXi, for individual VMs, then you go in there and you create them and you attach them to a port group. So what I've done here is I've made 3 different virtual machines, 3 different VLANs. It might be a little bit too small to see, but this says Windows Domain Controller, and this is VLAN internal servers. I just named it that. That's one port group, and then I have VLAN desktops, and then a Windows 7 desktop in that group, my VLAN DMZ, and then my LAMP web server there, and then my management network for ESXi. These are all port groups. They connect to one virtual switch, and that virtual switch connects to the physical port, which will be leaving my lab system. For Proxmox, it's largely the same setup. What you're going to do is go in and make Linux bridges, is what they call them, but it's really just another virtual switch, so I'm going to keep using that term to not be confusing. You make your vSwitches, you assign them to your physical ports that you want. So in this picture, VMBR is one of the switches. It's connected to Ethernet 0. And you can assign an IP to those switches. This is one difference between Proxmox and ESX. That doesn't have a VM kernel NIC. It uses an IP of the virtual bridge to manage Proxmox. So be careful where you assign an IP, because if you assign it to the one that's going to your internet side, then you're going to be able to manage Proxmox from the outside. That's bad. If you want to be able to tap this traffic, what you do is you take this command, brctl, it stands for bridge control, and you do set aging, the name of the bridge, and 0. What that does is makes the virtual switch forget which MAC address is on which port, so it sends all traffic to all ports, essentially making it a virtual hub, and then any VM that goes into promiscuous mode will be able to see the traffic, and you can tap it that way. In your virtual machine, it's very easy. You just create your virtual device and you tag it with whatever you want and you attach it to that switch. So not a big deal there. Zen server, same type of thing. What to know about this is however many physical connections you have to the outside with NIC cards, it will create 2 switches for that. So in this case, I made network 0 and network 0 and network 1 were auto-made with NIC 0 and NIC 1. And then I made these 3. These are all VLANs switches, and those VLAN switches have a number associated with them. So when I create virtual machines, then you attach them to this. This maps to a physical NIC, and then also a VLAN number, so your traffic will be tagged that way. And here's what that looks like. I have my Windows 7 VM, networking tab, and I just make sure it goes on my VLAN for the DMZ or whatever it is that I want to connect it to. OK, workstation. This is back to type 2. You can do the same thing here. You go into your virtual network editor, and VMware will make 3 different virtual switches for you by default. VMnet 0, VMnet 1, and VMnet 8. You may see them in your Windows networking devices if you go in there and you have this installed. You can add different ones by just creating them inside this virtual network. You can tell it to enable DHCP, and VMware will assign IPs for you if you want. But you create all the switches you want there. And then in your individual virtual machines, you just go to custom and you pick whatever switch it is you want to connect it to. With VirtualBox, you go in, you create your NAT networks and your host-only networks. These are also creating virtual switches. And then inside your VM, you tell it which one you want to connect to. One thing to note about VirtualBox, it will tell you on the interface that there's only 4 NICs that you can make per virtual machine, but you can actually do 8. Or 36 if you want to really get crazy, but you have to use a different virtual chipset to do it. But just you have to do it from the command line if you want to go with more than 4. So that would really probably only apply to doing a router in VirtualBox. OK, so which virtual machines do you want to go to? So we've got our hardware, we've got our hypervisors. Now the most important part is picking what type of software you're going to actually run. We're going to pick all of our VMs, and before we do anything, we're going to snapshot all of them. Snapshotting allows us to mess up anything we want and immediately go back to a known good state with one press of a button. It's very convenient. And you're going to collect all your VMs. What do you want? You want Windows Desktop, Windows Server. That's going to be the most common thing we see in our businesses. We're also going to want Linux. We're going to want stuff with apps installed, maybe some BSD, maybe anything else you can think of. But you want to collect all the VMs that you could conceivably want, get them to a known working state, and snapshot them. Is this going to be expensive? Not necessarily. With Windows, if you are a student, there are ample opportunities to get free versions of Windows Server. And if you can, I would get every license that you can before you graduate, because it will get somewhat expensive later on if you want the new stuff. So collect them all, ask your friends to give them to you, have them give you theirs, whatever it is. If you're not a student and you don't know any, Modern IE is a site that Microsoft has made. And it allows you to download a free virtual machine of any version of Windows. It was designed to help IE developers test their code for IE-developed websites. The only downside there is that these VMs expire after 90 days, but I think it's a good trade-off to just have to reset your VM every 90 days to get free versions of all the Windows you want. It seems like a pretty good deal to me. What you do there is you just make sure you snapshot before you boot it for the first time. You download it as an ISO or as a VMware VMX file. Just snapshot it pre-boot, because as soon as you boot the first time, that 90-day counter starts. And so when it expires, you just revert the VM. For server, TechNet Evaluation Center gives you 180-day licenses. So you can have a full year for free and just redo that at the end of that. That's going to allow you to get every version of Windows Server, as well as SQL Server, Exchange, Link, all of those kind of things that you want. Or Skype for Business now, maybe it's called. Some interesting options. Do you have a corporate laptop that runs Windows? I bet you do. Run Magic Jelly Bean. It's a tool that will tell you what the actual product key your Windows is running. And check the sticker on the bottom of your laptop, because a lot of times businesses use enterprise licenses and it won't be the same as the sticker. So you may have an extra Windows sticker on the bottom that's never going to be used for anything. Also, Craigslist, eBay, you can buy 2008 R2 for $90. So the older versions of server aren't very expensive. For Linux, obviously it's very easy to get free Linux everywhere, but those applications are going to be the struggle. When you want to set up WordPress or whatever it is, that can be a huge pain. So you want to get something that's already working. Bitnami.com and turnkeylinux.org offer VMs for apps ready to go. You can just load them right in and have your WordPress, your SQL, whatever it may be that you want. All right, so offense. When it comes to offense, there's a lot of options for distributions. Kali is the one we've all probably heard of. Pen2, BlackArch, Backbox, all of that stuff. But the goal here is get that VM, get whatever you want, but you want the infrastructure to match the corporate style network. So you're going to want a multi-segment network, and that's what we're going to be designing with that VM setup. So I would suggest making maybe a DMZ, a desktop's VLAN, a server's, maybe a guest. You could do a Wi-Fi VLAN, all of that stuff. Make your own mini company inside your server, and then you can attach this distribution anywhere you want. You can put it on the VLAN for desktops, and you can pretend you have remote control of someone's computer, or you have an unauthorized device on the network. You can put it on the outside VLAN, and you can try to attack the DMZ servers and try to pivot your way inside. Once you do that, you can put up your defense VMs and try to stop them, or whatever it is. But before you do all that, snapshot it all first. So whatever you do, you can easily go back to a known good state. So attack from all of those places, pivot around, try to stop yourself, try to catch yourself, and that will make you a truly great attacker and defender. And it's really important. This gets to the purple team concept. You will become a much better defender if you understand how attackers work, and vice versa. So this will allow you to do that in a very effective way. You can also do interesting things like mixing in physical components. If you had an extra NIC, you could attach printers, you could attach your slow cooker, your IoT devices, light bulbs, whatever you want, put it on its own VLAN, attach to your server, and bring that into the mix also. And then check if your defense picked it up. It's a good way to learn the whole process. And then the best thing you can do with this is script it all up. So with VMware, there's a VM run command or vimcmd for ESX. You can say revert to this snapshot by name. You list them all in a script, and it will revert your whole lab, bring up the whole infrastructure again clean. So it's very convenient. VirtualBox also has vBox Manage to do that. Here's what that looks like. So with your offensive setup, you have a lab that mirrors a mini corporate network. So you've got a desktop VLAN here of sorts. You've got internal servers, and you've got a DMZ. That is going to connect out your VLAN trunk to a physical switch, or later on I'll explain the all virtual version. And then you can go to your Wi-Fi access point. If you want to connect with your outside laptop into your internal server network, you just make an SSID that's on that VLAN. You can pretend you're over here from being outside on your Wi-Fi. So it's very, very flexible. So about defense, what should you use if you want to play defense? If you haven't done this before, I would highly recommend Security Onion. Security Onion is like the blue team Kali. It allows you to do network security monitoring, which is focused on data in motion. And what it does is it records all of your traffic. It will take full PCAP of everything on your network that it can see. So that will depend where you tap it. It has IDS built in. So Snort, Suricata, Bro IDS. It's got front ends for it available. It also comes with ELSA, which is a SIM-like solution. And then for packet forensics, it comes with a bunch of tools, Explico, Network Miner, ngrep, and all of that type of stuff. It's a great solution. There's some books by Richard Baitlick on installing this, and a bunch of other documentation online. This was created by Doug Burks, and he's done a lot of presentations that you can Google on setting this up. It's very easy. It's clicking next a bunch of times, rebooting, and then essentially doing it again and telling it what interfaces you want for monitoring and for management. And that's pretty much it. So to do that, you need about 3 gigs of RAM and enough CPU to support the pushing through it. Snort is obviously going to take a proportional amount of bandwidth compared to the amount of traffic it sees to analyze all that. But most importantly, you're going to need enough space to save everything that goes across your network. You can estimate that by looking at your router now. It probably takes some kind of measurement for you, and it will tell you maybe in the last month you've used 50 gigs or whatever. Maybe AT&T is putting you on a cap or whoever it may be and telling you because you're getting extra charged. Plan what you want to monitor. Look at your whole network. You could do that. You can go with just the virtual switch for your lab and tap just the stuff in the lab, or you can tap just one virtual switch and just plan accordingly. Here's what that looks like. It's essentially the same thing, but I've added one more component here. We have our port mirroring going from the switch to another physical NIC here to another virtual switch that connects only to Security Onion. So it's just one extra cord. I have one for the VM traffic, the VLAN trunk, and then I have one with all traffic from this link going back this way so that it can see not only my lab, but everything that's going on my normal house network. So if I get infected, I'm also going to know about it by this method. Log management VMs. If you want to just do more than PCAP, you can also use Splunk for free. You can use Windows Log Collection. The NSA makes a guide called Spotting the Adversary with Windows Event Log Monitoring. It's awesome for defense, but it also explains how to use Windows built-in functionality to roll all of the logs from multiple Windows devices up to one main Windows box. So you can try that out. There's also OSIM and ELK, which are some other free SIM-like VMs. If you want to do malware analysis, this one's a little bit different. You want to run in an isolated environment, and so you can create VMs and switches to do that. You want to have multiple hosts because your malware may do different things, whether it's Windows 7 versus 10, whether it's a domain computer or not. So you want to have a lot of options there. Remnix is the distribution I would suggest for that. It's made by Lenny Zeltzer. He teaches SANS Forensics 610. It's an outstanding course if you're into malware or you want to be. It's built for static and dynamic analysis. It auto-updates with all the tools, like Kali and like Security Onion. You just run a quick script and it'll pull it all in. And it will actually pretend to be the internet. So the interesting thing here is it runs a fake DNS server and a fake website and all of these other ports. And it will intercept traffic to any IP and pretend to be the most common services that malware will use to talk outbound and record it and tell you what it's doing. The thing you have to do to install this is install all your VMs, get them ready, and then tell them the Remnix VM is the gateway. So all traffic from the infected items will be going to Remnix, and then it will be able to intercept that and tell you what's going on. Of course, before you do that, snapshot everything, and then you begin your traffic interception, start your virus, and then infect, analyze all your hosts and all the traffic outbound, and then revert. You can do it again. Here's what that looks like. The difference here, I took out some of the other stuff. Mainly notice that there is no connection here, but there is here. And what I'm trying to demonstrate there is you still need to be able to get to the console for your lab server, but you don't want the virtual switch to be able to talk outbound. So you make the VM for Remnix, and you essentially point everything at this as if it were the gateway and the router and everything else. And all the traffic will go there. All right, so if you want to do your all-in-one lab, this is the everything in one. You're going to need a couple physical NICs. You need one to the internet, one to your switch or access point, and then maybe another one depending on what you want to do. Here's kitchen sink mode. You have your internet connection. You have a virtual machine being your router, and this would be pfSense, Sophos, whatever you want. You make a bunch of different virtual NICs on this, so maybe 5 of them. You have your desktop VLAN, you have your internal servers VLAN, you have your DMZ VLAN, you have your Security Onion box being mirrored traffic from these switches that you create in the hypervisor with 2 different virtual NICs. And then you have all the stuff that's on your normal network out here, which I didn't draw here. Other VM ideas, there's a lot of stuff built for security already out there ready to go. WebGoat, Security Shepherd are great options. If you want to do ICS and SCADA type stuff, there's a few more here. VulnHub, Metasploitable, those are very common. Do forensics. SIFT is one that's made by SANS. If you take base Ubuntu 14.04, you can actually build remnix, and sift into one virtual machine. So that's something you might want to consider doing. It's just a one-line script you run, and it imports all the tools and builds it all for you. So you could build one super defense VM for forensics and malware analysis. If you need more than this, this is a link that I like a lot. Some guy made the biggest mind map I've ever seen of all of the security-related VMs. It's enormous. So if you finish this, you're going to be a master. If you want to take it further than this, there are containers. Container support is built into Proxmox. That's something I didn't mention yet. You can download and install container VMs, which use almost no resources because it's a different virtualization type. You can cram a whole lot more on a server if you're able to run it in a container. Automation is another thing. You could use Vagrant to automate building your VMs. You can also make those scripts to auto revert and bring back up your whole lab environment. Cloning, as soon as you get a Windows VM that you like, you can just hit clone, 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 and then you'll have 3 users instead of 1. So think about doing that. You can virtualize real infrastructure and test that and not bring the risk of taking down your actual infrastructure for a pen test. You could try out the honeypot VMs. There's a lot of stuff out there for that. And if you need more than that, there's the Reddit Home Lab wiki and site that will give you a lot more options. Some further reference for this. There have been a lot of talks about setting up a VM lab in BSides, and they're all great. They've all kind of taken a different angle. I took this angle because I hadn't seen this done before, but there's some other ones here that I would highly recommend. This is setting up a test lab with VMware by Nicholas Chappell. He actually walks through installing ESX, creating the data stores and things like that that it takes to actually get it running. So if you want to do that, that will be a walkthrough there. Here's one on doing it all in the cloud, EC2 or bust. And there's one called Building a Cyber Range by Kevin Cardwell and a book that goes with it called Building Virtual Penetration Testing Labs for Advanced Penetration Testing. That one's all focused on emulating a customer environment so you can pen test on it. There's also a Proxmox cookbook I found out there, although I haven't read, I can't vouch for that.
A quick question on the cloud.
Yes.
A lot of providers have rules about not even running Nmap, for example, in the cloud. What's the...
Yeah, so I'm not sure, I haven't done myself, but I know that Amazon allows you to do like the VPC where all of your network would theoretically be internal to your own VMs. So if you're doing it like that, I would imagine it should be okay. It's probably just when it gets outbound. If you're doing host only and internal only stuff, I would think it might be okay, but they have a whole pen testing site for pen testing with AWS, so you can check into the rules there. All right, so the TLDR, in case you started daydreaming, here's all of it on one slide for free with least as hardware as possible. Get your extra computer with an i5, 500 gigs of RAM, 16 gigs of RAM, 500 gigs hard drive, put on Proxmox or VirtualBox depending on the type of computer it is, define your network segments and your switches, connect them all up, install pfSense as a router, get your VMs and connect the virtual NICs where needed. Get your Windows VMs from Modern IE, TechNet Eval, your Linux from Bitnami and Turnkey Linux. Then install your defense and your attack VMs. Set them up how you want. Tap your virtual traffic with your smart switch or with your virtual switches, however you want to do it. And then go ahead and hack the planet, revert it all, start it, do it again until you're a master pen tester or whatever defender, anything you want. That's it. Thank you very much.